Today we're going to be talking about fire regimes, and I'd say this is one of the most important concepts to understand if you want to be a part of the movement that takes Californians away from that mindset where fire's the enemy and we need to put out fire at all costs, which eventually just leads to fuel accumulating and then worse wildfires in the future, as we've seen over this last decade. If you understand fire regimes, you can be part of the movement that moves more towards living with fire and kind of living in balance with nature and doing what's not only best for the ecosystem, but what will help protect life and property within California or anywhere that has natural fire regimes like the California ecosystem does. So before I get into fire regimes, I should probably define them. A fire regime is basically just the category of fire that you would expect in an area. And by category, you can actually break that into time, space, and magnitude. And I'll get more into that in a moment, but it's basically saying like, how often does fire happen in this area? How intense are the fires in this area? How large are the fires in this area? And then every area that you're talking about is going to have different little nuances. So that's going to change kind of how we should manage those areas. It's not going to be, oh, this is the answer to solving the wildfire problem in California, and we need to just put this step-by-step process in place in every single ecosystem. Doesn't exactly work that way because each ecosystem can have its own individual fire regime, which means the solutions are going to be localized and specific for that ecosystem. So if that was very wordy and didn't really make sense, I can explain something that happened to me maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, which kind of cleared some of the fog in my own mind about fire regimes, and also shows why it's important to continue to research and not just hear one idea and then just go with it. A lot of times, the more research you do, the more you realize you didn't actually know in the past. And then it almost becomes addicting because then you start asking yourself, well, what do I now currently believe that if I just did a little bit more research, I would realize I'm completely wrong? And that actually also happened today while I was reading Fire in California's Ecosystems. And I'll get into that in a moment as well. So about 6 months or a year ago, I was reading, I think it's Fire in California Chaparral, some kind of textbook like that. And it was talking about fire return intervals and how they're different in the Chaparral than what we have in the Sierra. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you think about how these ecosystems behaved for thousands of years before humans moved to California. A large part of the ignitions would have just been from lightning. So up in the Sierra, you have a lot more lightning because of orographic lift. Your air rises up the mountains, forms some clouds, you get some thunderstorms, you get some lightning. And you'd maybe get a large amount of fires up there every maybe 10 to 15 years in an area. You'd have a fire come through, clear out some of the lower fuels. That would technically be good for that ecosystem because a lot of the, let's say, giant sequoias or pines that evolved there evolved with that fire return interval. So they don't like it when all the fuels accumulate if fire doesn't happen for 50 to 60 years if we're doing too much fire suppression. Because then what happens is the fire comes through and it's so intense that the pines or the giant sequoias that would have been fine in the past under those low intensity fires that were more frequent, their natural defenses are overwhelmed in those less frequent, more intense fires. And then basically the ecosystem is kind of destroyed instead of benefiting from a fire that could have come through. So up in the Sierra, the basic summary there, if you didn't hear anything I just said in the last minute, is that up in the Sierra, you might get low intensity surface fires coming through every 10 to 15 years. And the plants would have evolved differently because of that. Now in the chaparral, let's say the central coast of California has some chaparral. The central coast in California actually has the lowest amount of lightning in the United States. Pretty interesting fact right there. I believe it has a lot to do with the fact that we have the marine layer, We get a lot of cool, moist marine air that leads to a very stable environment because you have cold air on the surface, warm air above that. The atmosphere is more dense, underneath less dense, so it doesn't really want to have a lot of vertical motion versus some place where you have warmer air down below that just wants to rise up. And then that leads to more thunderstorm activity, leads to more lightning. On the central coast, very stable atmosphere, so not much lightning. So without many natural ignitions, and again, talking mostly about times before humans came here because that's where these fire regimes would have been set up and where a lot of these plants would have evolved. The fire return interval there might be 40 years, 50 years, or maybe even you get a fire coming through an area once every 100 years. So then that's going to shape the plants that you have in the California chaparral. For example, the one I always use is chamise. Chamise drops its seeds and then it builds up a little seed bank where all the seeds are just kind of stored in the soil. And then when a fire comes through, it activates those seeds and then they sprout when all the competition has been reduced. Now, the chamise plant itself, you would think it's destroyed when a fire comes through, and the entire top of it could look like it's gone, but it has a burrow underneath the ground with a store of resources. And then that can also resprout after the fire, almost like a phoenix, where you think the chaparral is killed, and then what do you know, it's back to life. But the key part there is that these plants evolved with fire return intervals of maybe 40 years, 50 years, or potentially even 100 years. So the defenses that they've built up, like that burrow or the seed bank, those would have evolved over a 50-year time span or a 100-year time span. What I mean by that is it might take 50 years for that seed bank to regenerate or to build up your savings enough in that seed bank. Or maybe it takes 50 years for that burrow to restore enough of its resources to be able to resprout after a fire. So then, if we were to have the same fire return interval in the chaparral as what we have in the Sierra, then that would overwhelm the chamise's natural resources. So the seeds wouldn't be able to build up enough in the soil, the burrow wouldn't be able to store up enough resources, and then if a fire came through, maybe it resprouts the first time, but then it's not expecting another fire for 50 years, but then if another one comes through in 5 years, then it wipes out all those new little sprouts, but those new sprouts haven't had time to build up more seeds in the soil or more reserves in the burrow. So then chamise is just wiped out. So the interesting point I'm putting forward there is that prescribed fire every 10 to 15 years might be a great idea up in the Sierra because it mimics the natural ecosystem and clears out those fuels that could go against the pines or giant sequoias' natural defenses, whereas prescribed fire in the chaparral every 10 to 15 years would actually overwhelm the chaparral plant's natural defenses. So what's good for the Sierra could be terrible for the chaparral. But then if you took the chaparral example and said, oh, let's only do prescribed fire every 50 years or every 100 years, and then you put that up into the Sierra, all the fuels would accumulate, huge fire would eventually come through, wipe out your giant sequoias. So that was probably more detailed than it needed to be, but I really wanted to explain that idea because that was one of the biggest ideas that I've learned over the last 6 months to this last year, where it really made me think, because before that, I had just thought prescribed fire is the answer to wildfire in California. Let's just do prescribed fire everywhere. That'll clear out the fuels, and then with less fuels, we have less intense fire. And it's very tempting to think like that, where you have a simple solution to what you hope is a simple problem, but in reality, it's actually a complex problem. So in reality, you actually need a complex solution. And if you just have a simple solution based on maybe overgeneralizations, you may end up actually hurting things more than you're helping them. Just like if you did prescribed burns in the chaparral every 10 years, you would wipe out the chaparral. Even if you had good intentions, which would have been leading to less extreme wildfires in the future by reducing fuels. So when I learned that, that was a pretty big moment where I realized, oh, it's not just a simple answer like I want it to be. It's actually going to be very dependent on the different ecosystems and the vocab word of the day, the different fire regimes. So I've already kind of given you an example of different fire regimes, but the exact categories that you put them in are temporal, spatial, and magnitude. So within temporal, just think of time. That's going to be the seasonality of the fires. Like maybe you have more fires in summer, maybe you have more fires in fall in an area. And then also with temporal, it's going to be that fire return interval. Do your fires naturally happen within an ecosystem every 10 years, or do they naturally happen every 200 years? And then within spatial, that one's pretty easy because you could just think size, and that is one of them. Just how big would the fires have been in this fire regime? Small fires versus large fires. And then also spatial complexity. Still don't totally know what that one means. I'll learn about that as I continue to read through chapter 5. And then finally, magnitude. So magnitude is going to be your fire line intensity. So how hot the fire is burning as the front goes through, or how much heat it's generating. And then fire severity. And finally, see if I can remember the last one. So magnitude was fire line intensity, fire severity, and the type of fire. I thought I'd remember all 7, and I did. So the last one is type of fire, whether you normally have surface fires that come through an area or crown fires. And what's interesting about that one, if we want to just make things a little bit more complicated, is you actually can have multiple fire regimes even within one ecosystem. So maybe you have so just thinking about all our different categories there, maybe you have small fires that come through every 10 years that are ground or that are surface fires, but then in that same ecosystem, maybe every 100 years, like as the pines in that area get old, then maybe you have a crown fire every 100 years as the pines really dry out. So you could have almost 2 different fire regimes within what you'd call one fire regime. That was probably a little confusing. I'll try to use an example there. So the Sierra and the Rockies have very similar vegetation. So you might think, and topography, so you might think, okay, they probably have the same fire regime. But the Sierra is a lot hotter and drier than the Rockies. So in the Sierra, we have a lot more surface fires that come through. Clears out a lot of the fuels, so there's a smaller fire return interval, but then maybe every once in a while you get the big crown fire that comes through. In the Rockies, it's not as hot and dry, so you have less fire ignitions, you have less fires that pop up, so then your fire return interval is going to be much longer, and then you maybe just have a huge crown fire every 200 years or something. So in the Sierra, it's almost like we had 2 fire regimes. In the Rockies, it's maybe 1 fire regime, but then even that is an overgeneralization right there. It's just trying to provide an example. So it's based on time, space, and magnitude. So why do we care about this? I think that's the best question to ask. So the reason we care about this is because if you actually want to help an environment, you would have to understand its specific fire regime. Just like I explained with the chaparral versus the Sierra, if you wanted to try to restore the natural environment and mimic and bring fire back into the landscape, because fire is a part of the California ecosystem and it should be a part of the ecosystem. But when we're introducing it back into the landscape, we have to understand how it was in the past, because a lot of the plants that live there would have evolved with that fire regime. So what was good for them in the past and how their environment and their fire regime was in the past is most likely the fire regime that they're going to want today. So this is why it's very important to understand all the different nuances and complexities in all your different environments based on the time, space, and magnitude of fires in the past, which would have helped evolve the vegetation that you see in that area, so that we understand what kind of management practices we could put in place in the future to try to bring that ecosystem back into balance with nature, which will most likely lead to less intense fires in the future. Now, one disclaimer there, one other thing that I learned throughout the day today, and I have to say it because I do kind of love those moments where you realize you're sort of wrong. I always viewed we want to put fire on the ground, clear out the fuels, so then there's less continuous fuels, you have less ladder fuels, so then less crown fires happen, because crown fires are too intense, they're a bad thing, they're dangerous to humans, life and property. So the correct fire management practices would be to reduce the probability that crown fires happen. But then, as I read this textbook, Fire in California's Ecosystems and the Fire Regimes little section here, I come to find out that there actually are just some fire regimes where they don't have a fire for 200 years, and then there's just a massive crown fire. So if we were to view crown fire just always as bad, then we would most likely put in some practices in that area which would actually take that ecosystem out of balance into how it maybe has been for thousands of years. And that would end up hurting the environment. So, yeah, the main thing to understand is that fire regimes are based on time, space, and magnitude. And you can break them up into different categories from maybe a 0, which would be no fire in this area ever, to maybe a 1, where it's saying there's low severity, small ground fires, up to maybe a 6, where it's every 200 years we have the most intense fire you can imagine that basically just burns everything. And you're going to have lots of different combinations of fire regimes within all of those different combinations that you can have with how time, space, and magnitude varied within wildfire in the past, so that we can take those lessons to decide what kind of management practices we should have in the future so that we can better live with fire. So I thought that was a pretty interesting section of the textbook. That's just the introduction to fire regimes. As I continue to read, it's really going to dive into all those different categories that I talked about within time, space, and magnitude. Let's just see for fun if I can name all 7 once again. So with time, we had seasonality and fire return interval. With spatial, it's the size of the fire and spatial complexity. And then with magnitude, it's going to be fire line intensity, fire severity, and I'm almost forgetting the last one again, and the type of fire, like ground fire versus crown fire. So that's our 7. That's what I'm going to continue to learn about as I continue to read Fire in California's Ecosystems. If you want to learn more about fire regimes and wildfire in California, you can stay tuned, and thanks for watching.